Happy Friday, Baylor College of Medicine and friends of Baylor. Let's talk about our holiday season. I don't know about yours, mine was miserable. Like many of my friends who have kids, we had a child show up that was positive, and so we spent our holiday season in isolation. Also, I have to say, we watched the Michigan-Georgia game. Lily was very upset with the offensive line play. But as she said to me, as Scarlett said to Rhett, there's always tomorrow. So next year, we're going to be great. Again, how many times am I going to say this? Next year, we're going to be great. Oh, and of course, we all have made our New Year's resolutions. And I'm very, very happy to tell you that I didn't break my New Year resolution until January 3rd. So I'm feeling very good. Last year, I think I broke it on January 2nd. So I'm making progress. In another 100 years, I might actually be able to get through an entire month of hanging on to my resolutions. Anyway, so let's talk about what's going on in the world of Omicron. It's actually interesting because almost every week I say, you know, the world map looks the same. It doesn't. It's really amazing with the U.S. and Australia and Europe really, really on fire. But I would like to point out there's two areas in the world that are kind of low, and that's Chile and Japan. And of interest, if you look at vaccination rates, the highest in the world, 90% in Chile because they participated in a countrywide clinical trial to be vaccinated, and Japan at 80%. And so, you know, when we've talked a little bit about herd immunity, herd immunity is really a formula. It's 1 minus 1 over the infection number, the R number. And this particular virus keeps getting more and more infectious. The R number used to be, you know, in the beginning 2, 2.5. When Delta came along, was 5 or so. It's probably doubled down, it's closer to 10. And so if you start calculating what does it take to get to herd immunity with an R number of 10, 1 minus 1 over 10 is actually 90%. And so in order to get to that place where most of the country or the world is immune, you need to be 90% or more resistant. Well, Chile is at 90%, and they're doing pretty well. And Japan's over 80%, plus they incorporate mask wearing on a regular basis. So that's why they're doing well. U.S., United Kingdom, Israel, we're well below that rate. We think we're doing well, but we're not where we need to be, in the 70%, 65% range. Of course, Africa, South Africa is 30%, and Nigeria, those countries are like 5%. So as long as there's the opportunity for this virus to replicate, it'll find hosts to replicate it. I'm always looking for good news. My sister asked, where's the good news? Well, the only good news about this is if you look at this huge spike with the United Kingdom, it's beginning to come down. U.S. and Israel are still on the way up, but South Africa, which had the biggest spike, is already beginning to come down, if you see that. And it's coming down at a relatively fast rate. Almost as fast as it went up, it's going down. And then the other good news is if you look at mortality, mortality really isn't spiking. So these are the kind of data that make you suggest, or it makes it seem like the virus, while more infectious, may not be more virulent. Virulence is making the host more sick. So look at Israel. They're a little bit farther ahead of us in terms of vaccination. Huge spike in cases, but if you look at their hospitalizations and their ICU utilization, it's going up, but at a much lower rate, and mortality hasn't budged. If you look, mortality really hasn't changed at all. And that looks a lot like what's going on in the United States. The United States, this huge spike. I mean, we had almost 500,000 cases a day last week. I mean, that is crazy. We were talking about maybe someday it'll get to 80,000 or 100. It's 500,000 in one day, per day. And hospitalizations going up. But death mortality rate is not rising. In fact, it's been very flat. And we're still at only 62%, 63% fully vaccinated, which is a real problem. And if you look at the slope of the rise, which I've just put these blue lines to show you, huge upward spike for the case number, much less increase in hospitalizations with mortality fairly flat. And if you look at who are the hospitalizations, who is going up, it's in the older age groups, over the age of 70, 65, those groups. But those are also the groups that have the highest amount of vaccination. So while they're being hospitalized, hopefully mortality won't change that much. And if you actually look at vaccination versus unvaccinated, you're 5 times or 6 times more likely to get a case of COVID if you're unvaccinated but you're 13 times more likely to have a severe outcome if you're unvaccinated. And if you add in booster shots, you're 20 times more likely to die than those who have had booster, and 10 times more likely to get a case of COVID. So vaccination helps. Boosters really, really help a lot more. If you look at the heat map in the United States, I mean, it is really phenomenal. Look at, it used to be light orange. Now it's bright red in most of the eastern part, southeast part of the United States, now the southwest. And Omicron has just completely taken over. It's now 95% of the viruses that are isolated by the CDC. And it's everywhere. It's not really regional. You can see this. The purple circles represent where it's predominantly Omicron, and you can see everywhere it's predominantly Omicron, all parts of the country. What about in Texas? I was so proud of us just a few weeks ago. Well, every major urban center is a mess, whether it's Houston, Austin, San Antonio, or Dallas, all on fire. And of course, poor Dimmitt County, you'd think there'd be the one time they'd be able to avoid it because they're out in rural community, but no, they're just as bad as Harris County. So, still really a lot of hot spots. And if you look at what's going on in the Texas Medical Center, we had almost 9,000 cases per day. Just, I think it was like a month ago. I was so proud of us. We were down to 232 cases per day over the rolling weekly average. Last week, 9,000 per day. And hospitalizations have, continued to double. It went from a low of 56 just a month ago to 100 to 200 and now 400 hospitalizations per day. So it's a big issue. So some data from over the holidays, our colleagues at Harris Health, that's LBJ and Ben Taub, admitted 77 COVID patients, 80% were unvaccinated. And if you look at the symptomatic patients, 75% were unvaccinated, 25% were fully vaccinated, and 0% were vaccinated and boosted. So again, just in our local community, you can see the advantage of being vaccinated and boosted. Methodist Hospital System reported, it has a paper in review, also over the holidays, reported 862 symptomatic patients. 90% were Omicron. 90% of those were Omicron. And they compared those patients to patients who were infected with Alpha or Delta in the past. They tended to be younger. There were more breakthrough cases, but they were less likely to be hospitalized, less likely to need respiratory support. And for those who were admitted, they had a much shorter length of stay, almost half the length of stay. And so what it's suggesting, all these data taken together is suggesting that it's much more infectious, but less virulent. In other words, it causes less severe disease. Now, if you look at when is it going to end, my sister's constantly question, when is this all going to end? I have no idea. But the Institute for Health Metrics and Evaluation in Washington has predicted January 28th will be our peak and it'll come down. Interestingly enough, there's nothing you can do at this point. Even if we get everybody vaccinated, this peak is going to happen. The only thing can actually blunt it would be wearing masks. And I don't get it, but in our community here in Texas, almost no one's wearing masks. Even, I don't get it. I'm wearing my mask more and more, but fewer and fewer people are doing it in our community. In some communities, they are. So, the question, what is actually going on? I mean, it's kind of confusing for people to see all this change. And what we're actually witnessing in real time is the evolution of a respiratory virus. It's moving from very virulent, cause a lot of host disease, to less and less, and being more and more infectious. And that makes sense. Remember, I answered in Q&A last week. Somebody said, well, how do these viruses compete against each other? And it's not that they're inside you competing, like Alpha, Delta, and Omicron get inside you and they fight it out and one emerges victorious. They're constantly looking for a susceptible host. And so it's more, as I mentioned last week, it's more like tag. If you are the virus that can find a susceptible host more readily, that's the selection process. And so that's what's going on across the world. And so you start thinking about, well, what kind of characteristics would be selected for? In other words, what would give an advantage to a virus? Well, if it replicated more, particularly in the upper airways, if it was transmitted because of coughing or sneezing, those kinds of symptoms, and that would lead to more and more virus finding a susceptible host and replicating and then passing it on. That's what we're seeing, and in some weird way it's kind of good because it's becoming less and less virulent. If you look at increasing virulence, like a virus like Ebola that kills its host very rapidly, those aren't general outbreaks because the host dies. It can't pass it on. So those things are self-limited and contained. This virus is getting more and more like a flu virus or a common cold virus where it's actually spreading very widely. We are very lucky that this particular virus still causes an immune response in our bodies that recognize the other viruses. So it could be really unlucky if our response to Omicron did not recognize the other viruses, but we're lucky in that it does. And it also explains, because it's a respiratory virus, why things like masks and social distancing and hand washing work. And that's why Japan is having such a good go at it, is because they are following 100% mask mandate. And that really, really helps. So what's the evidence for all that I'm talking about? I'm talking about all this evolution. What's the evidence? Well, we now know from tissue culture experiments that the virus replicates 70 times more rapidly than Delta does in cells from the upper respiratory tract. And in contrast, it replicates less rapid than Delta or Alpha in the lower respiratory tract. And there was a couple of publications this past week, really interesting. Mice and hamsters do not normally get this particular virus. They're not susceptible. But we can engineer those mice and hamsters to express the receptor in humans that binds to the virus. And so these mice and hamsters, they have that receptor just like they're human. And we can look at the kinds of pneumonias they get. And it turns out, in these mice and hamsters, Omicron produces a much more infectious disease in those mice and hamsters that are expressing the ACE2 receptor. So once again, these are papers in review at Nature, but the good news is that once again it confirms the fact that this replication of virus in cells actually takes place in animal models as well, again suggesting that the virus is replicating much more quickly in the upper airways. There was also a very interesting paper this week that came out, also in review, from a structural biologist. And they looked at all the mutations in the spike protein and tried to create a model of the virus binding to the receptor. And why is it different from the original one? And so for all of you golfers out there, the spike protein binds to the ACE2 receptor kind of like a golf grip, with a few fingers overlapping. Most of the receptor out here and most of the part of the virus out here. What's different with these mutations is it's more and more like a hand clasp. And so it's much tighter, and that's one of the reasons why there's more entry of virus into the cells, and one of the reasons why it might be replicating more. What we're lucky is that the antibodies to this conformation recognize this conformation. And so when you generate antibodies to the current conformation, it blocks this interaction. In contrast, antibodies to this configuration don't block this one. And so, that's a very interesting phenomenon that we'll have to see. But we're lucky in that the Omicron is generating antibodies that recognize. And there's really good evidence for this. Also, the paper came out of South Africa, looked at patients who were previously either vaccinated or unvaccinated, but who got Omicron. And then they measured their antibody responses. And what you can see is that whether they're vaccinated or unvaccinated, you get this huge response to Omicron. If you were infected with Omicron, you'd expect that, but a 14-fold increase in antibodies. But interestingly, a 4 to 5-fold increase in antibodies that block Delta as well. And so this kind of data is suggesting that if you're infected by Omicron, unfortunately, the good news is that you will have antibodies that protect you against the other viruses. And we talked about that in the Q&A last week, hoping that that would be the case, but it turns out there's now data to support that. Finally, I feel bad for the CDC. They're nice people, but they're constantly trying to keep up with the changes. They just authorized, boosters now for 12 to 15-year-olds. The FDA did, and the CDC is now recommending that boosters now take place not at 6 months, but 5 months. That's because unfortunately, these mRNA vaccines, they're great. They're very rapidly brought on, but the one problem with them is they don't seem to be that durable. In other words, the antibody levels wane over time. and say we need to get another booster, and they're recommending now the boosters at 5 months. There's also now with flu season cases of flu virus and coronavirus in kids. That's driving a lot of the new admissions in kids. That's what's going on recently. And then finally, I just want to mention a couple of things. You know, my sister wants to know always, well, what should I do differently? Well, I'll tell you one thing I'm doing differently. I used to wear a 2-layer cloth mask. That's, you know, back with when things were pretty good. I'm back up to an N95. And so I think, you know, wear your mask whenever you can, even if you're, you know, vaccinated and boosted, because you can still be susceptible to Omicron, and frankly, if you don't know the vaccine status of everybody around you, you should just wear a mask. Continue to, you know, if you're going to eat, dine out, do it outdoors. Or if you're going to entertain, do it as much as you can outdoors. I know it's tough in the cold, but I think still indoors with people you don't know or unvaccinated or may not be vaccinated is the most dangerous thing. And then, you know, right now I consider vaccinated meaning two shots and a booster. And so when you get your family together, be sure everyone's boosted. Otherwise, don't invite them. I mean, you gotta be, you know, contain your group of people that you're hanging out with. And I think in 2 or 3 months we'll begin to see this begin to hopefully bottom out. My hope is by spring we'll be back to something very reasonable. So at the end of this, I just want to do a couple of shout-outs. The first thing is Lily and I go walking through Southampton and in the Montrose communities, and we get stopped all the time. I want to thank everybody who's watching us, and particularly those who sent cards to Lily. Like, Lily, are you alive down there? Hey, Lily. Lily, oh, sound asleep. Okay, she's still, thank God she's still alive. And then the other thing I want to do is, I mean, all the people who are in the service professions, whether you're at pharmacies or grocery stores or in the retail world, you know, all you employees who are working through this and exposing yourself exposing yourself to risk, those are really helpful. You're doing a great service. And also, right now, I feel so bad for every educator in the country. All the stuff we're going through trying to keep kids safe. We got to keep our teachers safe too, and so I really want to empathize with you all. I know it's hard, but we all have to try to get kids in school and do our best as a team in the United States to try and get us all through this. So, you know, lots of things to be grateful for. We got through a really tough period of time, and I think we'll all get through this again. I know it's hard and it's getting really old. It's getting old for me too. But we will get through this. We'll all be fine. And I look forward to seeing you next week.